Hello, everyone, and welcome to our debate discussing the use of restraint and seclusion. In this debate, we will be discussing both the pros and cons regarding the use of restraints and seclusion. With us in the debate today, supporting its use is Jennifer as the attacker, Lauren as the prover, and Sony as a stater. On the opposing position, we have myself, Shailene, as the stater, and Adela as the prover and attacker. During this debate, each side will have a turn to discuss their position on the matter. We will begin with the proponents as they discuss their findings to support their position. Following, the opponents will have an opportunity to defend their standing on my signal to counter. Each side will have approximately 5 minutes to state their position and evidence. We will now have Sony speak on the findings of their position.
Hi, everyone. First, I would like to begin by defining restraint and seclusion. Vollmer et al. In 2011, in the Association for Behavior Analysis International Position Statement on Restraint and Seclusion, provide the definitions which we will be using today. Restraint involves physically holding or securing the individual, either A, for a brief period of time to interrupt and intervene with severe problem behavior, or B, for an extended period of time using mechanical devices to prevent otherwise uncontrollable problem behavior. For example, self-injurious behavior that has the potential to produce serious injury. Seclusion involves isolating an individual from others to interrupt and intervene with problem behavior that places the individual or others at risk of harm. When it comes to restraints, an individual must be trained in procedures to use protective holds, blocks, transport, or escort an individual safely. For the safety of both the client and the professionals, it is important to get the proper training. Lauren will be speaking about CPI and the need for de-escalation procedures. We are not proposing restraining an individual for overturning a table once and calmly sitting down. We are advocating the use where the individual poses an imminent danger to himself or others in the immediate vicinity. When all other strategies have been tried and failed, restraint and seclusion become necessary to prevent imminent harm. We do not want to harm our clients, but we also cannot sit back and watch or allow them to hurt themselves or others. As I stated, our position is that restraints and seclusion should be used as a last resort per Code 4.08c. Those who will be applying these strategies need to be properly trained to prevent injury to the client and themselves as per Code 4.08d. Also, protocols should be in place for the removal of these procedures as quickly as possible, as stated in Code 4.08d. Decisions should be informed by the data and not an emotional response. As behavior analysts, we have an obligation under Code 1.01 to rely on scientific knowledge, and Code 2.09 relates to the client's right to effective treatment, which may include restraint and/or seclusion based on the literature per Code 2.09a. Furthermore, Code 1.05f state personal beliefs about restraint and seclusion should not compromise their duty to provide effective treatment per Code 2.09a and c. To support the use of restraints and seclusion, the following points will be discussed: the history of the use of restraints and seclusion, and its use in imminent danger to self or others, the quality of the clients and their families' lives, and the issue of do no harm.
Okay, we will now be hearing from the stater on the con side, which is myself, Shailene. Opposed to the idea of using restraints and seclusions, we have done thorough research and have identified cases in which the use of physical restraints has caused serious injury to the individual. With a series of events in which restraints weren't used appropriately and without proper training, we stand firm in our stance that restraints and seclusion should not be an option to ensure the safety and dignity of the clients in which we work with. To support our stance, we will be presenting the following points: Sunland Miami case in which the individuals were mistreated and the use of restraints and seclusions weren't used with appropriate training and protocols. Wyatt versus Stickney case, which addresses rights for individuals with mental disabilities to receive effective and proper treatment. On this topic, we might also consider the companies that have been created to address aggressive behaviors because the reality is that they do exist. We might consider CPI, QBS, and all other safety care certifications that have been set in place to address these. Across all companies, prior to implementation of restraint, it is very crucial to implement de-escalation procedures as well as antecedent management. Antecedent management being of the most importance, as we want to prevent escalation, not only address the situation once a crisis has been reached. There are many events that have led to the ongoing debate upon this topic. Also to include a study by Ray, Myers, and Rappaport. In this study conducted, 1,040 individuals completed a survey on their treatment at a psychiatric facility. From this study, about 73% of the individuals reported that upon the implementation of restraints and seclusion, they were not dangerous to themselves or others. They reported that the staff had said their behaviors were inappropriate but not dangerous. The rest of the respondents reported only saying that their behaviors were not dangerous at the time. We will now turn over to Lauren, who is the prover on the pro side.
I myself, as well as many of the people in this debate, have worked with individuals who engage in self-injurious and harmful behaviors to others. The question we all want to answer is, how do we make sure our client and others around them remain safe? When these behaviors occur, it is our responsibility as professionals to make sure that clients do not harm themselves and or others. It is in the opinion of the pro side of this debate that the safest and most efficient way to do this is by utilizing the use of appropriate seclusion and restraints. That is not to say that professionals should engage in seclusion and restraint practices by default. However, when appropriately employed both technically and in response to self-injurious and harmful behaviors to others, seclusion and restraint is the safest and most evidence-based option. I would like to begin by discussing functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans. Professionals conduct FBAs and create BIPs in order to target problem behaviors. These plans are created on an individual basis. In some cases, seclusion and restraint are part of these behavior plans. This is a last resort measure that ensures that no one gets hurt. The point of a plan is to establish what a student's triggers are and how the situation could be de-escalated before it turns into a scenario where seclusion and restraint practices are necessary. This plan may include antecedent interventions, reinforcement schedules, incentives, replacement behaviors, etc. The plan will also include specific language that adults should use or not use when attempting to de-escalate the situation. If the situation moves into a crisis in which the student is harming themselves or people around them, then and only then is when seclusion and restraint should be employed. Supporting this claim, myself, Sunny, and Jen found a study that was conducted by Richard Fox and James Mendel, in which a behavior plan was created to address the aggressive behaviors of a 13-year-old boy with autism. The plan put in place included consistent and frequent positive reinforcement, a token system, allowed for the child to make choices, response costs, overcorrection, and when needed, physical restraint. With this plan, the boy's aggressive behaviors decreased to close to zero incidences, and the boy was able to make sufficient growth in many academic areas as a result. In addition, these results have been maintained for over a year. Seclusion and restraint was used in this study when appropriate and in response to self-harm or harmful behaviors of others, and contributed to the success of this behavior plan, not to mention kept the child and others safe. Next, I'd like to discuss the technical act of seclusion and restraint. First of all professionals working with children who have the potential to go into crisis behaviors, which result in seclusion and restraint, must be properly trained. There are many different kinds of programs that exist, including CPI, PMT, etc. I have worked in schools and behavior clinics, and in each of these places, my employers have made this a requirement of my employment. These practices follow the idea that seclusion and restraint are a last resort scenario and stress the importance of my above description, which includes other interventions put in place to de-escalate a child before it becomes appropriate to seclude and/or restrain them. In this training, one learns how to safely restrain and transport a child so that the child is not harmed in any way. The technicality of these restraints have been modified and changed over the years in order to make them efficient and safe for each person involved. In addition, parents are at a loss of what to do when their children are engaging in self-injurious and or harmful behaviors. Here is a video discussing family members' opinions on seclusion and restraint being included in their child's behavior plan.
Can you please describe your child's behavior?
Well, she had frequent meltdowns, which meant falling out, kicking. She could hurt herself, hurt other people. She would thrash around. She would also run anywhere, through an open door, out into the street, out into, parking lot, anything, run towards cars, just no thought of safety.
So what concerns did you have about your child's behavior? Like you mentioned eloping, so she was eloping into the street.
Yep.
Is there a specific time where one event might have concerned you more?
Well, I was frequently concerned about her maybe getting hit by a car. I was also concerned about items falling on her because when she took off running, she would not pay attention to objects. So falling objects could happen. She could injure herself on, corners of things, tables, anything. Just, I had a lot of safety concerns.
Okay. How did your child's behavior affect your child and your family?
Well,
Any limitations?
yeah, there were a lot of limitations. It meant that sometimes it was better to leave her at home with my mother, or another adult, because she did not behave in a socially acceptable way, certainly did not behave in a way that was good for her own safety, and it just could turn what could be a pleasant occasion into something that was a disaster. So that was a constant concern.
Yeah. What treatments were used in school?
Well,
Were they effective?
a lot of things were tried. Rewards could be tried, but because my daughter's meltdowns she would be fine 1 minute, and in the space of a second, she was having a full-blown meltdown. There was no warning, and no one knew what was setting her off, so it was kind of hard to deal with her. She also, once she was in a meltdown, you couldn't really reason with her or negotiate with her or promise her anything. There was just no awareness about what was going on around her. So that was a major issue. We sometimes had to use restraints because nothing else seemed to work, and we wanted to keep her safe.
So what was your initial reaction when the school used restraints?
Well, of course, like any parent, it wouldn't be my first choice, but if everything else wasn't working, we had to make that safety was a priority.
Okay. Did you see any changes in your child after the implementation of restraints?
Yes, it was effective because she didn't like it. So once if we knew that was going to be the result, she was actually listening more and understood that, failure to fall in line would result in something she didn't like. She would begin to actually pay attention to what you were saying. And then we were able to use other methods so that she could conform her behavior.
And how did the implementation of restraints affect your family?
Well, it resulted in her listening better. Uh, we were able to use other forms of discipline, um, timeout or rewards, things of that nature, because she actually was paying more attention to us.
So they were able to re-implement token procedures, reinforcement procedures, token economies to,
Yes.
to help her with those behaviors.
Absolutely.
And were they trained in the implementation of the restraints?
Yes.
And did they train you as well?
Yes. I was advised of the way to use restraints safely.
That's great. And now that she's much older, do you have any regrets about using restraints? Letting them use restraints at school?
No, because it was for her safety. I mean, failure to do something could have resulted in her having serious injury. So, always my first priority is keeping her safe.
So, would you, based on the fact that restraint was used and the behaviors decreased, is there any doubt in your mind that it was necessary at the time?
I know it was necessary because we did not have her attention, and because her behavior changed so suddenly, there wasn't, we were always in a situation where we're reacting to her meltdown. But there was no warning it was coming, and we would have to get her attention. Until we had used restraints, we didn't have her attention. We couldn't negotiate. We couldn't, there was nothing to be done at that point. We tried so many other ways, but this was actually the most effective way at the time to keep her safe. So I don't have any regrets there.
Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
While at first the family may not be comfortable with seclusion and restraint, the procedures have proven to get children's behaviors under control, and over time, families become more comfortable. When professionals create proper behavior intervention plans, as well as get training on the proper way to employ seclusion and restraint, the use of seclusion and restraint is effective and safe to use with children who are engaging in self-injurious and harmful behaviors. The use of restraints allow BCBAs to follow the ethical guidelines created for us by doing no harm to clients, relying on scientific knowledge, maintaining competence through professional development, describing conditions for behavior change program success, and considerations to regarding punishment procedures.
Okay, we will now be hearing from the proven the con side, Adela.
Hi, everyone. So it all started in Florida in the early 1970s. The Sunlight Miami scandal demonstrated clearly how individuals with developmental disabilities were abused in inhumane ways in the hands of the so-called professionals who were supposed to be trained with the use of restraints and seclusion settings. This incident, as well as others, played a huge part in what came of the Wyatt versus Stickney case in the 70s as well. Initially, the case began so that acceptable conditions could be brought forth in institutions with developmentally disabled people, but it quickly led to deinstitutionalization and treatment known to us today as the least restrictive environment. However, we are still left with the question, is the use of restraints and seclusion ethical? And even more questions arise, such as, what are the benefits of restraints and seclusion? What are the long-term consequences of restraints and seclusion? Is there an appropriate age where restraints and seclusion began? How many people are injured or killed by restraints and seclusion yearly? How effective is restraints and seclusion? Does restraints and seclusion change behavior? What qualifies for restraint and seclusion? Who or what professional actually decides the qualifications of seclusion and restraints? Let's see if we are doing better today as trained professionals than over 40 years ago. Shailene, if you could please play the video.
To Congress of special needs children under restraint getting hurt and even killed. Here's CNN Special Investigations Unit correspondent Abby Boudreau.
Christopher, out for a walk. That spin? A sign of autism. No one argues this teenager has been a very difficult child to manage. But here he is again last October. The abrasion? His parents with signs of abuse.
And he was injured at school, and this ended up being his very last one.
The school said the injury happened during a bar procedure or brief assisted relaxation restraint. And this is how that relaxation technique looks on school security video. What you're seeing is footage from the Princeton House Charter School for Children with Autism in Orlando, Florida. Notes sent home in 2008 by Princeton House show a disturbing escalation of Christopher's disruptive behavior.
He slowly started to become a loner. He started to become really quiet.
And his mother says he was becoming increasingly violent, so destructive his parents even had to call the police for help. As things got worse, they started asking questions, which brings us to this tape.
And every day he would say, Mama, no class, no school. I said, Papa, no, you have to go to school. You have to. You know, and I'm going to have to live with this guilt. I know everybody says it's not, you should not feel guilty. But this is my boy.
The video chronicles 2 days last October. It was given to Christopher's parents, who showed it to us. October 2nd. Christopher flips his desk, not uncommon for children with autism. And then he gets dragged from class repeatedly. At once, he's put in a face-down phone restraint for 7 minutes. A short time later, he's restrained another 10 minutes. Finally, this scene in the library, with a staff member next to him. Christopher upends a table and is once again restrained. Teachers struggle to put him down.
This is what disturbs me. These staff members are not in physical control of him.
For Professor Wanda Moore, a top expert on special needs children, these are precisely the kind of situations where children have been seriously injured, sometimes fatally.
So one of those things there, but for the grace of God go I. This is why we stress that these are interventions or procedures of very last resort because they are deadly.
Florida regulations only allow restraints to, quote, prevent injury to self and or others. For example, in cases of hitting, kicking, headbutting another person. None of that happened prior to the restraints we saw on the tape. And while common sense dictates there should be consequences for bad behavior, according to experts, that approach doesn't work well with autism. Princeton House's core staff were trained by the Professional Crisis Management Association in Sunrise, Florida. The director of that program says, well, he's not seen Christopher in person and doesn't know a lot about the teenager's background. The behavior on tape did not seem to merit the staff's reaction.
Several things in my opinion were not done correctly. In several of those instances, it didn't look like crisis to me. It looked like a single episode of table flipping.
So should he have been put in prone restraints?
From what I could see, I would have to say no.
We asked Princeton House, Orange County Public Schools, and the State Department of Education to speak with us on camera about the video, but they all declined because the incidents are now under investigation. Christopher is now at a new school and is doing much better. His parents say they're wiser for what they went through, and so far, Christopher has not needed to be restrained even once. But Wolf, although he's doing much better, Christopher's family is not letting go what happened or intend to sue the school for child abuse and federal civil rights violations. Wolf?
Abby, thanks very much. Let's bring back Tom Foreman. He's here in the Situation Room. Also joining us, Congressman George Miller of California, the chairman of the Education and Labor Committee, and Jane Hudson, she's here, senior staff attorney for the National Disability Rights Network. I want to go to the Congressman in a moment. What's your immediate reaction, your first impression seeing that report?
That student is not the only student in the country that this is happening to. There's hundreds of students. And the Government Accountability Office, Congressman Miller, our agency, many other agencies have documented this over the last several years.
Let me ask you a question about this. If we run this video here and we look for a moment, and the target area we're going to pay attention to is right here, this young man. This is where it happens. He comes in here and suddenly he flips over the desk and he gets surrounded by people here. When this happens, at this moment, Congressman, let me ask you, what rights should this young student have at that point?
Well, the first right he should have is whether or not his parents have been informed that this actions are being taken against him. Secondly, I think when you see an incident like that happen, the first thing would be for the staff to gather themselves and make a judgment about what's taking place here, rather than just pouncing on this student, essentially almost from behind, surprising him, or in the cafeteria, humiliating him. And what you see is this apparently was done over and over and over again without any improvement in the young man's behavior. I don't know all of the particulars of this case, but what the Government Accountability Office told us is these actions against these students are taken over and over and over again, and nothing changes because they're not properly trained. They're not assessing whether this is effective or not effective. Is this helpful or not helpful? They're just simply out of control in many states and many school districts.
So, Jane, I just want you to, is it your sense that some of these people, they probably think they're doing the right thing, protecting the student, protecting others in that room, are just not well trained for this kind of autism?
That's right. There's no training. There's often not school policies or state laws or federal laws setting the standards. So it's ad hoc. They figure out how to do it themselves. And in this case, as Congressman Miller said, what caused this incident? If it happened many times, what strategies were used to prevent it in the first place?
So what rights should these people have? The teachers and the people in the room are the adults, because as you know, if he hurt somebody in the room, they'd be the first ones who are nailed for that. What should they do? What rights should they have?
Actually, they have a right to be trained. And many teachers are not trained, and they're put in classrooms with these students. Also, substitute teachers are not trained often, or school bus drivers or others. They really need the training, because there are ways to prevent these incidents from happening and to take control in the classroom.
So more parental involvement, we're hearing, more training for the staff on call.
Congressman, is there a role for the federal government in all of this?
Well, I think clearly there is. Many of these children are certainly being financed with individuals with disability funding, but there's obviously an interest in the humane treatment of these individuals and doing something that is effective. The Obama administration, the Department of Education, is working with the states, with our committees, with the General Accounting Office, trying to come up with a policy, hopefully to put the states in the lead. Some states have gone and developed a fairly decent policy in terms of parental notification, training, outlawing certain restraints and seclusions that have taken place in the past. And what we're trying to do is gather that information, come up with a model set of codes, and ask the states to put them into place. And if they don't, then the federal government can step in. But remember, for a number of kids, this has been deadly. They have died as a result of this. It's not just a question of whether they're humiliated or they're harmed, or frightened, and all of the terrible things that they have died. And the other thing is happening, these actions are being taken against very young children, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. So this is way out of control in terms of how we treat children, whether they have disabilities or they don't have disabilities. And certainly when you do it without first clearing it with their parents.
You raise a good point here about the children, and that's the last question that I want to raise here. What about the rest of the people in this room? What about all these other children over here? Because many parents have dealt with the issue of having a disruptive or a troubled child in a classroom, and they find themselves saying, what about all the other kids when we're so worried about taking care of this problem? Should we have better mechanisms when a child is just having problems as severe to get them out of that environment for the good of these kids? What do you do about that?
Well, we have a process that's been in the law now for 30 years. It's called an individualized education plan. You sit down with the child, you sit down with the parents, you sit down with the school, and you work out a plan of action for the most difficult children, for the multiply disabled, for those who can function and not function, but a conscious plan. You don't just wait for the child to act out in some fashion that they may or may not be in control of, and then pounce on them with physical abuse and sit on them until they suffocate to death. That's just unacceptable. We have a process in the law, and hundreds of thousands of parents and children and school districts and others go through it every year, and they seem to manage this, but we have other situations where they're simply out of control.
Congressman George Miller, thanks very much for coming in. Also, Jane Hudson, Senior Staff Attorney for the National Disability Rights Network. Important subject. We're not going to go far away. Continue to pursue this as well.
Thank you, Shailene. So, as we can see, nothing good out of the restraints and seclusion, and all of the training requirements and protocols, professional and ethical compliance codes for behavior might look good on paper and might even sound good in theory, but unfortunately, it is a very sad and different story when it is put into practice.
All right. We will now hear from John as the attacker on the pro side.
The video concerning the teenager at the Princeton House Charter School in Orlando, Florida, further shows the importance of having an increase in training, observations, and stronger policies in regards to the use of restraints and seclusion. Congressman George Miller, who is the chairman of Education and Labor, raises 3 great points regarding the misuse of restraints: the need for parent involvement, the need for more training, and the need to assess the data. Firstly, Congressman Miller questions whether the parents were informed or aware of the restraint procedures that were being used on their son. According to the Ethical Code 4.04, parents need to give informed consent before the use of restraints can be used. Secondly, he talks about the need for more training, which is outlined in Ethical Code 4.08d. While it is mentioned in the school that the teachers at the school were trained using PCMA, the director at the PCMA training commented that the procedures were being used after only one incident of the behavior, but they were trained to use the restraints after multiple episodes of the problem behavior. This discrepancy shows the need for ongoing training as well as supervision to ensure the correct procedures are being performed at all times. Congressman Miller adds that it is important to train not only the teachers, but the aides, substitute teachers, bus drivers, and anyone else who may come into contact with the students with interfering behaviors in the school setting. Finally, Congressman Miller discusses the need to assess the data and make alterations depending on whether the treatment is working or not working. He mentioned the same techniques were being used over and over without looking to see if these techniques were working or not. According to Ethical Code 2.09d and 4.08d, the BCBA is responsible for reviewing the data and making changes depending on the upward or downward trend of the data points. It is appalling to see such infractions occurring to anyone, but it is important to remember that these infractions are occurring in the school districts which are not required to follow the ethical and compliance codes laid out by the BACB. These situations of Sunland and Princeton House show us the importance of having these ethical codes to ensure the safety and best practices for the clients. We can also see that restraints and seclusion should only be used as a last resort, with parental consent and under the training and ongoing supervision of a BCBA. When following these rules, restraints and seclusions are effective at reducing the dangerous and severe behaviors so that the clients and their family have the opportunity for a better life.
Thank you, Jennifer. We will now hear the attacker on the con side.
Thanks, Shailene. So Lauren in the post had mentioned the need for defining the topography of the behavior using the least restrictive procedures. However, we have seen multiple cases where neither of these happen. We have seen the misuse of these procedures where the schools claims that physical restraints are only used in emergency situations, but there's evidence that they are used for many other behaviors that do not constitute emergencies, such as when the child is non-compliant. There's also evidence of seclusion being used as a timeout procedure with the intention of using seclusion as a consequence for inappropriate behavior with the intention of reducing the behavior. However, if the behavior is still occurring, the punishment is not working and needs to be adjusted accordingly. The other point the other side makes is the need for least restrictive procedures being used. There is little empirical evidence to confirm positive advantages of using restraints or seclusion in the education setting. On the other hand, there is empirical evidence to support the use of proactive positive behavioral plans rather than the reactive use of restraints and seclusion. According to Ethical Code 2.09a, we need to rely on the current research and employ the treatments that are proven to work and be effective. Additionally, what the pro side fails to mention is the number of severity of cases of restraints and seclusion that have caused physical and emotional harm to clients. One of the core ethical codes states that we do not harm. However, this is not the case when using restraints and seclusion. First of all, most of the cases that use restraints and or seclusion are in children with disabilities. When working with children with disabilities, we need to remember that these children learn differently. These children may not know what the appropriate behavior is. They may not know what the right or the wrong way to act. And if the restraints and or seclusions are not being implemented in a contingent and consistent manner, they may not know what they are being punished for. Furthermore, children with disabilities may not be able to express their fears after the use of restraints or seclusion. When interviewing children in mental institutions about the use of restraints and seclusions on them in these institutions, they express feelings of anger, anxiety, confusion, depression, helplessness, and despair. We cannot say that children with disabilities are not feeling these emotional harms after they are exposed to restraints and or seclusion. For example, a 4-year-old girl in West Virginia was strapped in a chair with multiple leather straps that resembled a miniature electric chair. She was later diagnosed with PTSD after this restraint due to her frequent temper tantrums that began occurring and also frequent bedwetting. Additionally, a 13-year-old boy in Atlanta, Georgia committed suicide by using a rope after being left alone in a seclusion room for several hours. The pro side mentions wanting to keep the client safe. However, we have to question the safety of the procedures when it leads to short and long-term physical and emotional harm to our clients.
Now hear from Tony.
As we stated previously, the use of restraint and seclusion should never be a default procedure. Its use is a last resort where all other procedures have failed and can be proven by the data. Per Code 4.08a, reinforcement procedures are always recommended whenever possible. The Fox and Mendel studies show the appropriate use of restraint as part of a behavior plan can be effective in decreasing dangerous behaviors. As Lauren pointed out, the use of restraints and seclusion need to be done by professionals who have had the training necessary to do a proper restraint. Those cases mentioned by Adela are cases that are tragic, but although those people may have been properly trained, they did not have the supervision of a BCBA per Code 4.082. Also, as mentioned by Jennifer and Lauren, the use of restraints and seclusions must be part of a BIP. Informed consent must be provided by the parents or caregivers, supervised by a BCBA, and all persons interacting with the client must be closely monitored and trained. In closing, Jennifer, Lauren, and myself would like to stress we are not advocating the use of restraint and seclusion as a default treatment. Alternative treatments must have been tried and failed. The use of restraint and seclusion is a last resort, with treatments individualized based on the function of the present behavior. Vollmer et al., the U.S. Department of Education, Davis et al., they all agree there may be instances where restraint and seclusion may be necessary due to the dangerous nature of the behavior to themselves or others. As behavior analysts, treatments must be based on the literature per codes 1.01 and 2.09a. and we must maintain competence by reading the appropriate literature per Code 1.03. Due to the harmful effects of restraint and seclusion, we must adhere to Code 4.08A through D, which outlines the considerations regarding punishment procedures.
Okay, we will now hear from the con side for the conclusion. Donisco not reported on efforts to reduce seclusion and restraint in a psychiatric hospital. It was similar to what we do in the field of ABA, but it is something to consider. One of the first things that were looked at was the criteria for review for a case in which seclusion and restraint was implemented. In ABA, I think that after the first instance in which it appears that an individual may be dangerous to themselves or others, or may have a history of causing harm to themselves or others, that they should be placed in a setting that would prevent the use of restraints until data shows stabilization. With this in place, it would prevent the need for restraints to be used to protect others. In the event the individual is causing harm to themselves, I believe there are other ways in which it can be prevented without using restraints. For example, I have worked in a home in which an individual engaged in headbanging. Restraints were not a part of the behavior plan. Instead, body pads and guards were used to block the head from surfaces that could cause harm. Looking at this situation, I think it also brings an important point across, and that is that engaging in restraints can also cause more harm to the person implementing it versus the individual engaging in it. For example, in the event the individual that is engaging in dangerous behaviors is bigger than the person or persons trying to implement a restraint, they may be able to cause more harm, whereas they can protect themselves as well as the individual by using blocking methods and de-escalation methods. There are many cases and events in which parents do not consent to the use of restraints and seclusions. In these events, alternatives must be considered. As the opposing side has mentioned, times have changed and there are more laws and regulations protecting the rights of individuals and ensuring that there is proper training in place, as well as consent before restraint or seclusion procedure can be performed. In conclusion, the use of restraints and seclusion is controversial, and both sides have presented valuable data and statistics, which allows us to have a better understanding to support the evidence behind each stance. There are considerations to be made before the proper use of physical restraints and seclusions can be addressed. Of the importance, we must always consider Ethical Code 4.09, which states behavior analysts review and appraise the restrictiveness of procedures and always recommend the least restrictive procedures likely to be effective. With this in place, the least restrictive procedures might not always be effective in keeping the individual and others around them safe. There are protocols and ethical guidelines that must be followed before a procedure involving physical restraint would be implemented. As mentioned, it is important to be proactive in implementing antecedent prevention strategies and de-escalation strategies. From research and studies, we are all aware of the correlation between behaviors and antecedents. Therefore, in trying to decrease the probability that a crisis will occur, it is important that we take the necessary precautions to prevent them and teach replacement behaviors proactively. This now concludes our debate, and thank you all for watching.